Yeah, good day, Year 10. So, what we're going to do today is have a good look now at some of the issues of energy security. We looked at the energy mix, we looked at where people get their energy from, some of the issues with supply. So now we're going to look at some of the issues of and the impacts of energy insecurity, what the problems are if you don't have enough access to energy. So, just to start you off, a little bit of a skills-based question, two images of the local area, one OS map and one of a photograph. A classic exam question, in which direction was the photograph taken? And then true or false, the pier is south of the train station. So as before, on the sheet, in your books, however you're doing it, write your answers down and pause the video. Okay, so going through the answer to this, you can see the pier here. So the pier is here on the photograph. It is to the right and in front of you. So the only place the pier can be both to the right and in front of you is if you are on this road here, looking that way. North is always up, the top on a map. So they would be looking at east for their direction. True or false? The pier is south of the train station, or the pier is here, as we said. Train station is up here. There would always be a key if you couldn't remember that in the exam, and yet the pier is south of the train station. So now looking at energy security, quick recap. Remember, security is when supply is greater than demand. If supply is greater than demand, we have an energy surplus, we have energy security. Energy insecurity is when demand is greater than supply. If you have energy insecurity, you may try to generate more energy resources within your country, import from other countries, so increase supply, or you could actually reduce your demand, so reduce energy consumption. So it's this balancing act, supply demand. If supply is greater than demand, you're secure. If supply is less than demand, you are insecure. So many countries have an energy insecurity. So we will try and get more energy. So in the UK, we've got our wind farms, we've got our solar plants. We're looking at fracking to generate more of the energy we could have. We do import a lot of our energy from other countries already, and we are trying to reduce our energy consumption to become more energy efficient. So can you match the labels to the picture? So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 labels there and 6 images. If you're not doing this on the worksheet, if you're doing this in your books, maybe just think A, B, C, D, E, F. So start with A here, B, C, D, E, F, if you're doing it on a sheet, going round clockwise. So answer the question, please. Okay, so going around clockwise, we have exploiting new and controversial energy reserves. Fracking is a very controversial source of energy. We could allow people to extract energy from more environmentally sensitive areas or areas that are more difficult to get the energy from. We could have a look at industrial output. So, low energy security or energy insecurity, we could get low industrial output, one of the main users of energy. It can impact on food production, biofuel production. Growing crops purely for the generation of fuel and energy means there's less land available for growing food. There could be conflict. Russia supplies a lot of Europe with its gas and has the ability to turn it off. It was one of the reasons that the European Union did very little when Russia invaded the Crimean Peninsula and sort of annexed that from the country of Ukraine. We couldn't really do too much about it because if we did, as the European Union, Russia could actually basically turn the power off to about half to a quarter of the countries in Europe. And there are economic and environmental costs. As energy prices increase, which would happen if you were insecure, food prices tend to increase as well because energy is required in the creation of food. So I want you to have a look at this video now, which is looking at the Arctic. Should we be drilling or not drilling for oil? Now, normally I would be teaching this unit after we've done our cold environments. So do bear in mind, normally we would have looked at cold environments slightly when going through this. I've changed the order due to the lockdown because this is a slightly easier unit to get your head around.
2007 held the record for the most dramatic Arctic ice melt ever recorded until this past hot summer, when that record fell by an area the size of Texas. While many see this warming trend as part of a planetary disaster, others are more interested in the massive oil reserves now opening up in the Arctic Circle. And tonight we take you a couple dozen miles offshore from Point Hope, Alaska, where ABC's Cecilia Vega found the front line in a battle between sea conservation and oil exploration.
Woolly socks, check. Emergency radio, check.
Got it.
Robotic arm? Check.
Lock it tight.
Okay, go ahead.
We are about to enter the frigid waters of the Chukchi Sea off the north slope of Alaska. It's one of the most remote places on Earth, but these days, it's also a battleground.
Here we go.
All right.
Because under this sea, there's thought to be nearly 30 billion barrels of oil.
This is amazing already.
And just a few miles from us, Shell is gearing up to start drilling. They hope to strike it rich, and Greenpeace hopes to stop them. It is a dangerous mission. Just me and Greenpeace marine biologist John Hocevar.
We are on the bottom.
We're on the bottom of the Arctic.
At about 200 feet down,
Oh wait, there's something.
the world outside our sub is teeming with life.
Looks like a crab.
Plankton, krill, a seabed blanketed with starfish,
The whole floor is covered with them.
and creatures that seem from another world.
Whoa, it's huge.
That is the biggest basket star I've ever seen.
But Hocevar says drilling could spell catastrophe for this fragile ecosystem that sustains life all the way up the Arctic food chain.
If you had an accident here, you'd be talking about millions and millions of dead organisms.
Shell has spent billions of dollars just for the right to explore for oil here, but the payoff stands to be enormous. The Arctic may hold a quarter of the Earth's undiscovered oil, enough to drastically reduce America's dependency on foreign supplies.
Now begins the creation of the Mudline Cellar.
The oil giant has promised to drill safely and responsibly, developing new technologies to reduce drilling noise and dedicating a fleet of vessels ready to respond to a spill in 60 minutes, 24 hours a day.
Shell bent over backwards over the last 5 years to compromise here.
And Shell has found support in some unlikely corners, like Bob Reese, an environmental writer who spent 3 years reporting on the battle for the Arctic.
I think that if a company does bend over backwards, they ought to be rewarded for it.
And that reward came directly from the Obama administration, which gave Shell the green light to start drilling. Shell declined our request for an interview, but told us in an email, the debate on whether to evaluate Arctic energy resources is over. We are now focused on safe execution. But Greenpeace says it's time to draw a line in the ice. They vow not to stop until all Arctic drilling is banned permanently.
To drill for oil, is utter madness.
Earlier this year, activists disrupted operations on a Russian rig for 5 days, despite being pummeled by water cannons, falling into the icy Arctic waters when their boats were flipped. But in their fight against Shell, Greenpeace is now trying a different approach, science. They invited us to tag along. It's a bumpy ride to their research hub 40 miles offshore.
They say if you fall in this water, you could easily die within just 3 minutes.
We are welcomed aboard the Esperanza, Greenpeace's refitted Russian Army fire ship.
Thank you.
And life on board is what you might expect. Tofu for lunch, a very serious recycling program, and an eclectic crew from all over the world who dedicate their lives to the cause.
In this remote, unforgiving environment, we all know it would be impossible to clean up an oil spill. We can't risk it.
Do you stop any kind of development because a spill could occur? Or do you have systems and backup systems and other backup systems to deal with a spill, which Shell does, and then allow it to proceed?
You know, it's a tough battle sometimes to choose.
For those who call the Arctic home, like Point Hope, Alaska Mayor Steve Omatuk, there are no easy answers.
People need money. They need our economy to come up, but we need our way of life also.
Drilling would bring in much-needed jobs, but Steve says his community will always rely on life in the sea to survive.
The ocean is our garden. The animals are our identity as a people.
Pretty peaceful down here.
And down below, our exploration of the Arctic's underwater gardens continues.
Oh, what's that?
There is one final discovery.
It could be a coral. That is potentially a very exciting find.
Like you got him.
And away we go.
We make our way back to the surface for a closer look at the catch. First, a gargantuan starfish.
Probably weighs 8 pounds.
And then, what Hocevar is really excited about.
Here, this may be a soft coral, and if so, this would be the first specimens of corals ever collected in the Chukchi Sea.
Environmentalists say these creatures may offer big insight into what's at stake.
We're rushing ahead to allow drilling in the Arctic, and we don't even know what's down there.
Greenpeace faces an uphill battle. Shell has already begun preliminary drilling, and next year looks set to be full steam ahead. I'm Cecilia Vega for Nightline off Point Hope, Alaska.
So, to drill or not to drill? I want you to sort these out into arguments for and arguments against. Right then, let's go through and check your answers. So, for increased energy security for the country who is getting the oil and gas. The Arctic is extremely fragile, so an argument against. Drilling equipment could sink into the ground when the top soil layer melts in the summer. So, generally speaking, the top layer of ground is frozen in the Arctic. In summer, in some regions, that soil layer melts and then becomes often very soft, and you can get sinking of equipment or buildings. Increased profits and income, not just for the country, also for the government, because that company, sorry, not just for the company, but also for the government, because the company will be paying taxes. Environmental consequences of an oil spill obviously would be catastrophic wherever it happens, but the Arctic is very inaccessible and very fragile. And generally speaking, you will have to pay people a lot more to work in the Arctic as you would to work somewhere else. So it increased the cost of extraction. So energy and food. So biofuel. This is the type of fuel created by agriculture. Tanzania, we burn firewood, main source of energy. They spend more time collecting wood than they do farming. So the time spent collecting wood reduces the time they've got to farm, which impacts on food security. It's very similar to, the argument with water insecurity. Actually, it's normally the girls, the women, can't access education, can't do things like that, because instead of doing that, they're spending their time collecting water. So being without reliable access to sufficient quality of affordable, nutritious food is food insecurity. So more than 800 million people every day are living with hunger or food insecurity. So, got a video clip here. I'll bring that up full screen. Have a watch of that. And that's looking at, the situation of food, not fuel. So looking at this idea where countries are using large areas of land, to grow fuel as opposed to food.
Ranik askat jo oni kama jogin setiap alpas kapok kek bira kharup ta ciknan ilo lain ustana nak akna naru cicip kling kacin akwan ko sakit siap raling ula anak sibano din alebaan ode ha ana ancikrina ilo untuk ustana rali ka ko akak cina ju supaya ha ana ani na cil chot khaba na laka ko kan khapok kek bira aru okra ka kam sinki cengke نكى خل لقاء مشنا وما تبيرو قصيص إن سكوكو شب تقدر سكر كلون خا تقصي قصيب إنكي كوكو شب تقدر سليكيم كنا قنا وشاب تيرو أتبو كبيرو كن كتخش أتباليرو من نجيش كتي تاري يا أنا أتخش تجي تاي جي كان كتخش بوم جي كان كتخش غاسوليش موتوسير أنا خشوا أنا أليش خشوا لا أوه سكونيش ألا دين كوك ألو كان كيني سوم آتنا.
Travel through Guatemala and it's easy to understand why the indigenous Mayan people consider the lands to be sacred. But the beauty of this landscape hides the truth about a conflict which scars it. Inequality and a lack of land rights led to a brutal 36-year civil war which facilitated a genocide against those indigenous people. Now, that war is over now, but the inequality and the conflict over land remains. Today, 70% of Guatemala is owned by just 13 families, making this one of the most unequal and poorest societies on earth. Increasingly, those families are using Guatemala's lands to satisfy European demand for biofuels. Here in the Polishig Valley, people are now going hungry because lands they once farmed are now being used to produce biofuels for export.
Quancha kahal, quancha kaik, quancha chihoni le katsekian, chak chiruli lo na heha anna. Chalen chak na so kana chas bane la kana la katyuka makoto ha takokik chiruli lo na heha an. Chalen chak na se kon le kamama le kisaan ut dak se kon ka se jo ka ki la kana la katyuka ut la oho rangi so kana.
Unak kwa hong si tay kon chok pe trabahi ko kale ka ja ban ko kale pero nok se ko dong kha chakaan mga ka chikul ko kul balao ko kan khana an li ra chikus ka kul hara yo ko ribal.
It was at this site in March 2011 that this conflict was brought to the Mayan community of Rio Frio. On the morning of March 15th, 1,000 police, army and private security guards arrived at this field and violently evicted almost 800 families who lived here. Their houses were bulldozed, their crops were burnt. The eviction was carried out to grow this, sugarcane, destined to be processed into biofuels. Lands once used to grow food for Guatemala's people are now being used to grow fuel for European cars.
Lilin ko aluk kwa ite se sihi chichakali de haru chigna ilok stop ale ko pas de kwan kat khap lin ko homat yan ke sihi chikhali arkwani na ko chala se kangi aran ki oso aran se skrap wa ti de chibendi tot aran se skat de chiben la ka otot mak a chikna ko shoru kha chiri sin kilaran sa dipona daan porque mak a mas li os skaka mak ko so kwanta se kera Hunak medio otara ustara na kantara se kanaka otaan mak sa humpat na kwan hum sa ma khairi sanke ka ka ko ye ngara so kana chi mak a chi kero khai so kana kha chi hong la khatik.
After the eviction, the Rio Frio community moved here to this site into temporary shelter built by Trocra, and last year over 4,000 indigenous people marched to Guatemala City in protest. It took them 9 days, but it did force the government to promise to resolve the situation. So far, their words have come to nothing. The people still live here in temporary housing with no land and no food.
Entonces se va a producir una situación de mayor más hambre en todas las familias, pero para las familias desalojadas esto se complica mucho más, el hambre que van a sufrir es mayor.
Disputes over land rights in Guatemala date back centuries to the arrival of the first European settlers here, when newly created land deeds were drawn up and used to evict Mayans from lands which had always been theirs. With no rights to lands of their own, indigenous communities in Guatemala have among the highest rates of malnutrition in the world. The growth of biofuels means that there's less and less land available to grow food. Food production has gone down, food prices have gone up. The result, a disaster for indigenous people. Despite 36 years of civil war, nothing has really changed for indigenous people here. Wealthy landowners have turned Guatemala into a factory to service international interests while paying little or no regard for the lives of the people who live there. While we turn a blind eye to this, the landscape of Guatemala will continue to be scarred by hunger and conflict.
So this is the idea of biofuels, biological fuels. So arguments for and arguments against. And this is where this food, not fuel argument comes in. And often biofuel comes from sugarcane. So, same again, for and against, pause the video. Let's have a look at our answers. So for, it helps combat climate change. Although you burn the biofuel, it's on quite a tight and short cycle. So the carbon has been taken out of the atmosphere and gone into the crop. The crop is then turned into biofuel and burnt, and the carbon is released. So although there is carbon released, it's the same amount of carbon as is taken up in the growing process. It's a very tight turnaround, so it doesn't have a overall effect, an increase. It's not ancient or fossil carbon that's being released. Arguments against, they've caused a rise in food prices. They're grown on land used previously for growing food crops. And the argument for is it reduces dependency on fossil fuels. It would be a very easy solution. Biofuel is a liquid. Often you can make biopetrol, bioethanol. That could be used to power cars, and much of the existing infrastructure and petrol stations could be used for that. Modern cars could be fairly easily altered and changed to run on biofuels. But we don't have enough land to generate enough biofuel without significantly impacting on our food production ability. So what is the impact of energy insecurity on industry? Well, we need it to power industry. South Africa has frequent blackouts, so other companies will not invest in that country. They're not going to go and build their factories there, build their plants there, if they don't know how often they're going to get turned off, how many days they're going to use, which can cause all kinds of issues in terms of production, meeting deadlines, and so on, and obviously reduce the effectiveness of the company within that country. So often this leads to a potential for conflict. Water is one of the reasons, dams and water security comes into this as well. What we're going to do now is just have a look at the River Nile. This is a 360 video. So actually what I'd like you to do is watch this by the link as opposed to watching it inside this video. I cannot make this a 360 video, so it's designed to be worn with either virtual specs, a VR headset if you happen to have one, or you can flick around with the mouse and scroll around and watch the video in 360. So it's quite an interesting way to watch a video, and it's looking at the impacts of the dams on the Nile, because each time you dam a river, as you move further downstream, you are affecting the flow. Now the Nile flows through a large number of countries, and if one country dams it, the next country gets less water. So if we're damming these rivers to generate hydroelectric power, so we're generating energy, not necessarily for water, we are affecting the flow further down. So if you've got one dam that's creating hydroelectric power and you create a dam above it, you can cut that dam off. Not only can you reduce the water getting there, but you could also reduce the other country's capacity for generating hydroelectric power and electricity. So have a watch of that video. And then just a final task, can you name all of the countries the Nile runs through? So from T, as it were, U and K, all the way down. Can you name all of those countries the River Nile runs through? And think about why there's potential conflict here. Okay, just go through the answers in a second. Okay, so here are the answers. Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan and Egypt. Arguably also Democratic Republic of Congo and Central African Republic, although on that map it's quite hard to see that actually goes into those countries. So that is a large amount of Africa that is reliant on the Nile. And in effect, the rainfall actually kind of stops about here. So the majority of this area of the Sudan and Egypt, their only supply of water is the Nile. countries here, they have got the supply of water because that's, you know, the rain that's falling that's feeding the Nile. But each one of these dots, okay, are major population areas. So you think if Sudan dams, if we dam here, we stop the water supply moving down. So last question, suggest one way in which energy insecurity might affect the quality of life of people. Okay, just go through it again. Remember, it's one way, it's 2 marks, so it must be developed. You must have a therefore, so this means. Okay, you must develop your point. You get 1 mark for your identified point, and you get your 2nd mark for your extension. So there could be a lack of energy for domestic needs, or due to a lack of energy, it is harder to cook food or boil water. Therefore, there is greater disease, which can cause sickness and diarrhea, could lead to death, could lead to a lack of education. We could look at links to national economic circumstances. So, for example, the lack of investment in South Africa. We could look at impact on farming and how difficult it is to transport when you have a lack of energy. Okay, so that's today's video. Hopefully a bit shorter. I am trying to cut them down a bit week by week. You've got a couple of videos inside this to watch, which does lengthen it slightly, but it's not all me talking. So make sure you get those submitted. Try and get me a nice clear picture, and I'll feedback on those as quickly as possible. And I will see you all again next week. Thank you very much.